and online. Sorry, we're just starting a little late here. The weather kind of slowed us down getting set up and getting everybody set up online, but I think we're good. We're ready to go. We're glad to see you. These meetings, we've decided to have one in Brandon and Wagner this year. Peter Sexton, the manager at the Southeast Research Farm, was kind of the push behind these meetings, as well as a couple of our speakers today that you'll hear from. Really, rye has become more popular as the last couple of years have continued on, and we're seeing people more interested in growing rye for grain and forage both. We also have some local seed dealers. One of them's here today, Yankton Seed House, and also Millborn Seed. Locally here are our sponsors today, and we really appreciate their sponsorship. They have both taken an interest in rye as well, and working with that seed. Hybrid rye is a new thing, and that's really, I think, gained some traction as well with some of our local seed dealers and producers. So before we get started, a big thank you to our sponsors. The Brandon meeting is sponsored by, like I said, Yankton Seed House and Millborn Seed, as well as a decent sized mini grant. I believe it was $4,000, Pete, right? From SARE, Sustainable Ag Research Education. And they were going to have a booth here today as well as Millborn, but the weather kept them away. So we want to make sure we give them good recognition. And I think both of those representatives are with us online. So this morning, we're going to start off with a talk from Dr. Peter Sexton. He is the manager at the Southeast Research Farm near Beersford, where they have been doing work on rye for a few years now. And I think you'll find he's got a lot of great data. It's very relevant to South Dakota. And as we see rye kind of up and coming in this area, I think that the data that Peter has is going to make a huge difference in helping people better understand what works and what doesn't. So Dr. Sexton's been with SDSU since 2014? Oh, I'm way off. 2009, sorry. And he started off on campus and now works down at the Beersford Research Farm, does a lot of work on a lot of different things. But rye is one of those. And today he's going to talk about both grain and forage production as kind of an intro. So I'm going to apologize in advance for any issues we have, but I think things are going okay. So hopefully we can continue on today and appreciate everybody making it both here and online.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so can you all hear me all right? Okay, I assume the online crowd can hear me.
Yes, that other microphone, as long as you hold it.
All right, okay. So we kind of want to talk about rye today. As Sarah said, it's an up and coming crop. And we think agronomically, it's very robust. It has a lot of disease resistance. It needs less nitrogen than wheat. It's more hardy in terms of surviving the winter than wheat. With the hybrid rye, we have a nice yield potential, but and it's very competitive with wheat. So it's got a lot going for it. But we kind of need to understand and see where the boundaries are for its use, both as a crop and with livestock, so that we can make the best use of it, and so that we can fit it in our rotation without causing too much trouble. So we kind of want to go through that today, and we're going to start out talking about it as a forage crop and the grain, and then the livestock guys will pick up after that and talk about its use in feed rations. So before I get too far along, I want to recognize the crew at the Southeast Farm. Let's see. I can just advance it. Well, I don't think the thing's plugged into it.
You just have to click it. Click on the slide.
Okay, yeah, I was using that.
It'll work now. You just had to click on the slide. There we go. Clicker will work.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge the crew real quick. Gerald Williamson, he's kind of the elder statesman at the farm, keeps the equipment going. Scott Bird is the livestock technician. Ruth Stevens is a secretary and bookkeeper, and she's here today, and she keeps everything organized. Ashley Colford worked for us last summer as an intern. Jocelyn Forsett is a new hire from Alberta. She works with in crops research. Brad Rops is operation manager. Gretchen Koinga keeps our high tunnel going, and myself. So whatever good work we've got here, it's by God's grace and the hard work of all these folks. So we want to start talking about forage rye. We've run it over several years, quite a few years, about 10 years as a cover crop. We get about 3/4 of a ton to a little over 2 tons per acre, just as a cover crop with minimal input. Usually run about 1 ton to 1.5 tons. And that's planting it after corn harvest. If we manage it for high forage production, so now we're going in after oats or after an early soybean, get it in by the 3rd week of September, give it some fertilizer, we'll get up to about 3 tons per acre, roughly. And of course, it depends on your fall moisture. If you don't have any fall moisture, you're not going to get a lot of production because it's the same as late planting. And then it grows very fast in May. So the later you burn it down, the more biomass you're going to have, but the more water it's going to use and the more nutrients it's going to take up. So you kind of have to balance those two things. If you let it go and grow late into May, it's going to add a lot of weight, but it's also going to use water and take up nutrients. So this is just an example to show you kind of how robust it is relative to other small grains. This is from our winter annual forage trial this last spring. This is the rye here. You can see how it's greened up nicely. This is April 1st last year. The wheat and the triticale coming out of winter dormancy much slower. So the rye is usually head and shoulders above the wheat and the triticale in terms of early spring growth and total production by the time you get into early May or late May. I've got, this is a picture from our forage trials just the day before they were harvested. We try to take them at boot stage. This particular year, we were running around 18-19% crude protein and about 70% TDN. Again, this was fertilized too and planted early. So I'm just going to run through some quick data for the last 4 years on our annual winter annual forage trials. And I don't want to go in a lot of detail. There's a lot of numbers here, but this line here, Hazlitt, has done well each year. So in 2019, we got a little over 2 tons per acre. In 2020, it was the number 2 line. We get about a little over 4 tons per acre that year. We cut a little bit later, so the crop got a little more biomass on it, closer to heading. The other ones were cut more at boot stage. In 2021, we're over a little over 3 tons per acre. It's the number 3. In 2022, it's number 2, just about 3 tons per acre, a little shy of 3 tons. Over the 4 years, the average is just over 3 tons per acre dry matter. So if we consider that like on a silage basis, that would be about 9 tons per acre. And again, this is with early planting it 3rd week of September, more or less. It's not like planting it first week of November. So we're looking at early planting and we're giving it fertilizer. Okay, the other thing you want to think about with rye is this really potential for really rapid growth in May. So this is some data from 2017. This is May 16th, we're about 1,300 pounds per acre. 2 weeks later, we're about 3,000 pounds per acre. So this increased about 2.5-fold in weight in just about 2 weeks' time. So when you go from mid-May to late May, it grows really fast. This is data from Ben Brockmuller's master's thesis. Again, we're here, this is May 1st date. We're about 300 pounds per acre. May 30th date, we're about 2,500 pounds per acre. So we went up about 8-fold in biomass in the month. So it takes off like a rocket when you get into May. If you've got a good stand and it's got some fertility, it's going to blast off. But at the same time, it's using moisture. So this is data from Minnesota, couple different locations. The black line is fallow and it's soil moisture. So on this axis is soil moisture, and on the x-axis is the date. The black line is soil moisture in a fallow. The red line is soil moisture under a rye cover crop. And what you notice is early May, it hasn't used a lot of moisture yet. If we go back, we're down here. It hasn't put on a lot of growth. Time we get into late May, there's used a couple inches of moisture. So if we're worried about moisture, we want to terminate it back here before it's used much. And this is going to vary based on your operation. You know, some people, they need the forage. Their operation's more dependent on cattle and forage than it is on the next crop. And they'll say, I'll risk it and I'll roll the dice and let the rye go. I want the forage. Other people are like, nah, this rye is a bonus and my next crop, soybean crop, is what I'm really interested in. Then they're going to want to kill it early. So it's going to be different for every person, but this is where you want to make a decision before it uses a moisture. Once it takes off, it's going to use moisture. Okay, second thing it's using is nutrients. And this is, again, data from Ben Brockmuller's thesis. This is the rye cover crop, the potassium level. 70 pounds per acre, just manages a cover crop. So kind of low input, low production. This is with higher input, higher production estimate. We have about 170 pounds of potash. So now, if I'm taking that rye off as a hay crop or a silage crop, it's used 2 inches of moisture. Also, I'm taking 70 to 170 pounds of potassium out with it. And the thing where this becomes a real issue is if you go into a drought, potassium becomes a critical issue for resisting drought stress. So it's kind of a double whammy. If you're in a low potassium, if you're in a marginal potassium situation, you let the rye grow, you remove it all. Now you use the water and it took potassium away. Your next crop's going to be in a difficult spot. If you got plenty of potassium, this doesn't matter. I mean, so it depends on your situation, but just you want to be cognizant of it. Other thing that's going on over time is the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the rye is going up. This is, again, is from Ben's thesis. Here we've got it plotted rye biomass, but this is really a function of time. So as the rye puts on more biomass, the carbon to nitrogen ratio and the fiber content of the rye goes up. So that means the later you let it go, the slower it's going to break down and release nutrients. So if you kill it early, it's going to break down rapidly and release nutrients. If you kill it later, it's going to have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, higher fiber content. It's going to break down slower. In terms of forage quality, this is some data out of Wisconsin. We're looking at relative forage quality on this axis. On the x-axis here, we're looking at days after boot stage. And we can see the quality goes down sharply after we hit boot stage. So those are the things you're balancing as you're looking at rye as a forage crop. The later you let it go, the more tonnage you're going to get. Once you go past boot, you're going to see the quality drop sharply. And then along the way, it's using moisture and potassium. Okay. We've done a little bit of work with it as a grazing. I wish we'd done more, but we didn't have the resources to follow up on this. So this is kind of older data, single year. We grazed it, the rye in the spring, pulled the cattle off this, soybeans got planted last week of May. And we see where we fall in spring grazed. We had 60 bushel, just spring grazed, again about 60, ungrazed 46. Statistically, these are all the same. Numerically, the grazed ones did a little better. So there's good potential here with well-managed grazing to graze it in the spring. The advantage of this is you're keeping the nutrients in the field. Like I talked before about removing the potash. If you're grazing it, the nutrients are staying there. Most of them pass through the animal and come out the back end. And also it leaves residue in the field. So as long as it's well-managed grazing. So versus cutting it for silage, wouldn't leave any residue. So this is potential. We've got people from south of Beersford that do this on a routine basis. They'll raise rye, graze it hard in the fall, come back and graze it in the spring and plant beans. And there's other people doing that too. So this is an option to consider. Now this is on pretty mature no-till ground. So it's got good strength. So it holds up with the grazing. If you're in a tilled situation, and especially if you had high moisture, it would turn to muck, if you had cattle out there. So you got to think about that too. Okay, This is another trial just looking at another example of soybeans following rye cut for silage. We had different maturity groups here. They really all did fairly well. And the take-home message, this was planted in early June. We got 60 bushel an acre, which is quite similar to what we had on the rest of the farm. So this is a year 2017 with good moisture. Now in a drought situation, 2021, our checks did 63 bushel per acre and soybeans following rye silage did 29. Our nearby check for an early corn line ran about 160 bushel per acre for corn, where we planted that after cutting rye silage, we had 73. So you can see in a year with good moisture, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. It's well managed. In a year with drought stress, this cut our yield in half. This is similar data, similar study, a little bit different slightly from this last year. So 2022. And again, in Beersford, we were in extreme drought stress in 2022. It was a very, we only got about half to 40% of a crop off the rest of the farm. So it wasn't a good year for us. But what we see is that over here, we're looking at an early soybean. We only got about 20 bushel an acre. On the rest of the farm, we got about 34 bushel on average. The corn, Brad didn't even harvest it because the production was so bad. I just put less than 25, but there wasn't hardly any corn there, and he didn't think it was worth his time. And so that was totally crashed. Versus the rest of the farm, we're running 75 to 80 bushel an acre. So in a severe drought situation, the moisture that rye uses can be critical for your next crop getting established and getting going. And that's a situation you just have to judge year by year and your situation where you are for moisture. You know, if you're further east of us, it might not happen very frequently. If you're west of us, it might happen quite a bit. And here, I think we're looking probably at 1 year out of 5. This is going to happen. Forage sorghum, we came in with forage sorghum trial, did a variety trial, and that averaged about 13 tons per acre. We put the rest of the field into a forage sorghum, and that went over a little over 13, 14 tons an acre. So that was a better choice for us in this year. Some people have had trouble getting forage sorghum going after winter rye, but it's worked for us. We go in right after the rye is harvested, spray it with glyphosate, and when the soil temperature is right, we put in forage sorghum, and we've done it about 3 times, and it's worked for us. But so you want to think about your situation with that too. But in this circumstance, the forage sorghum was a much better and return on investment, $780 per acre versus the early soybeans, $280 an acre. So this is another point you want to think about. If you keep the rye, you cut it, you harvest it. And now, if you do find yourself in a drought situation, you might want to change direction if possible. Instead of going with soybeans, you might want to go with a warm season, drought tolerant forage mix of some kind, depending on your circumstances for silage or grazing. Okay, so decision points, just kind of recapping this. Pre-plant, am I managing for high forage production or just low input, low risk, and just want to throw something out there and cover the ground? So that's going to determine your planting date, your seed rate, and whether you use fertilizer. Your next point of decision is in late April. You have to look at your moisture situation and the forecast, and as a judgment call, just got to pray and make the best decision you can. But if your moisture is critical and your next crop is much more valuable to you than rye, if it looks dry, you probably want to spray the rye out in late April, first week of May. But that's going to be a different situation for each person on their operation, the value of the rye versus not. And also it's going to vary from year to year, obviously. I mean, some years we had great luck and we got the rye and we had moisture and we put the beans in and we got a nice bean crop, and, you know, everybody's fat and happy. But in a dry year, it doesn't work that way. This hasn't for us. Okay, so late May, your third point of decision, if you kept the rye, took it off, now you have to decide what you're going to follow up with. Do you want to follow with soybeans, or do you want to go with a warm season, drought tolerant forage of some kind? Okay, another option that we've found, and we've done this a couple times, is fall grazing. So this is hybrid rye Tio. We had about 1,300 pounds per acre. So we had good moisture in the fall of 2021. This is planted about September 23rd. We ran the cattle out the last week of November. I told Brad to graze it really hard because we were trying to separate doing some variety work, and we we're trying to see which ones would handle it better than others. And then came back this next spring and summer, you couldn't tell what was grazed and what wasn't. And the grazed side of this yielded 93.6 bushel, and the ungrazed yield 93.8. And we set this up, Brad set it up with a jigsaw thing through the fields. We had grazed one side and not on the other, and then we took yield samples. So it's just replicated. This is, okay, so what's going on here, Austin, is we're planting hybrid rye in the fall, mid-September. And in this particular year, we had good moisture, got good catch. So we got a nice stand of rye in good fall growth. Then we're grazing it hard in late November, and then we're keeping it for grain. Oh, soybeans before the rye. Yes, I think that was early soybeans. Yep. Okay, I missed your question. Sorry, yeah, so we had an early soybean line here, harvested the beans, planted the early soybeans. We planted the rye into soybean stubble. I think it was September 23rd was the planting date, if I remember right, 24th, something like that, close to that.
So then if the cattle graze it off in the fall, it does still go back to the spring.
That's been our observation. I mean, we could probably do this more years. But we did it once with open pollinated rye in 2013. We had good luck, and then it just worked out that we were able to run it this way because we contract feed cattle, and sometimes the guy that owns the cattle takes them early, and we can't. So we're kind of at their mercy as far as when they bring the cattle and when they take them.
Graze it in the spring, then it does not go back.
If you graze it in the spring, it'll grow back, but you would take a yield hit almost certainly. They do that. Like way down south in Oklahoma, Florida Panhandle, in between there in the Gulf states, they'll raise winter wheat. They'll come in and because they got mild winter, they'll run cattle in it, and they'll run the cattle until early spring till it starts to joint, and then they'll pull the cattle out. But I think in our environment, if I haven't tested it, but my guess is if we had cattle in there in the spring, we would have taken a good yield hit.
So in the spring, if you harvested it, then it won't grow back to graze in the fall. And it's bad every part.
Yes, so let's say, okay, so I got 5 minutes. All right. Okay, I'll try to answer quickly then. Okay, so the situation is, so this is, just to be clear, this is a grain crop. We harvested this in July. Okay, if you came in here, cut this for hay or silage at the end of May, then you would want to apply glyphosate to it or something to control it so it won't grow back, and then you'd plant your next crop into it. If you let it flower, so it heads out, and you can see the anthers, and you crimp it or mow it at that point, it mostly won't grow back. It'll mostly be dead on its own. But by the time it gets to anthesis, it's headed out, your forage quality's gone way down. So you really want to cut it before that if you're interested in the forage. So, okay. All right. So keep me honest, Sarah. A couple minutes, it's getting worse. Okay, so we'll fly through this. This is some variety trial data, and we've run it for 4 years. And the point I wanted to make with this slide is whether we look at the average hybrid versus average open pollinated, or the best hybrid versus the best open pollinated, we get about 30 bushel per acre better yield with the hybrid lines. So for grain production, if that's what you're after, this hybrids will average about 30 bushel an acre better. In a drought year, we're looking at 15 bushel. And in a year with good production, we're pushing 50 bushel an acre yield advantage. So in our experiments, that even whether it's good or bad conditions, the hybrid lines will consistently outperform the open pollinated lines. Second thing I wanted to bring out is the rye is very competitive with weeds. And this is from a drought year, 2012. It's the severest drought, I think, at the farm in my lifetime. We're looking at 300 pounds per acre with the rye and 500 pounds, 600 pounds per acre of weeds in the wheat check. Now, this is an organic plot with no weed control. When we have a better moisture, the wheat, this is weed biomass doubled in the wheat with good moisture. Look what happened to the weed biomass with the rye when we had good moisture. Practically went to zero. Your 20 pounds per acre is almost nothing. I mean, you're out there hunting for weeds. So when you have good rye growth, you don't have weeds. And we see this at our farm where we've got a good stand, and we get good establishment, we don't need any herbicide. Now, if we end up with a poor stand for whatever reason, then we'll come back and spray sometimes. But it's very competitive and good at suppressing weeds, which I think in the future, as we get more and more herbicide resistant weeds, this is going to become a bigger factor. So it's diversifying the rotation, which is going to help you with corn rootworm, but it's also going to help you with water hemp and herbicide resistant weeds. Okay, so I'm just going to buzz through this really quick. We want to plant it mid to late September. Because it is so competitive, you don't want to have it around wheat. This is critical because it's more competitive than wheat. So if it gets in the wheat system as a volunteer, you're not going to get rid of it. It's tougher than wheat is. So if wheat's part of your system, you want to keep it out of that area. Planting date mid to late September. Seeding rate with the hybrid lines, 800,000 seeds per acre. With open pollinated lines, we go with 1.2 million. Seeded about a inch depth or to moisture. 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel. So we figure we're shooting for 110 bushel per acre. So we put 110 pounds of nitrogen on. And we'll put about a quarter to a third of that in the fall and the remainder in the spring. Boronate is labeled for rye, but if you got a good stand, you probably won't need any herbicide. Fungicide, tilt is labeled for rye. We haven't had to apply any fungicide yet. I think if we had a really wet year, I'd scout and see, because then under high moisture conditions, you're looking at high yield potential and disease pressure both. So it'll probably pay for itself. In a dry year, this hasn't been an issue. Yes, that would be only if you're going to take it for grain. And I don't know that you'll. It is susceptible to leaf rust, but it hasn't been an issue yet. But if it were, this tilt is relatively affordable fungicide and it's labeled. But I would scout before I sprayed, and I would only spray if I was in a good moisture situation. I was looking at high yield potential. Okay, Sarah hasn't pulled it yet, but all right. So this is rye yield. This is planting date. This is observation for you because it's from last year, and we're comparing different fields. So it's just an observation. But September 23rd. We those fields averaged over 80 bushel per acre, and on average, we lost about 0.8 of a bushel per day that we planted later. And so this is really going to depend on your weather. If you have an open fall with good moisture, and the next year you have good moisture and it's cool, this might be a lot flatter. It might be more forgiving. In our situation, we went into extreme drought. So these guys that got planted late went further into the drought. And so there was quite a penalty for late planting. And then I've got to talk about ergot. This is an ergot body in a rye head. It infects at flowering. Once it pollinates, it's resistant, but before it pollinates, it's susceptible to the ergot. And this ergot fungus can infect brome grass, it can infect wheat, it can infect barley, it can infect timothy, it can affect a number of grasses. Not rye is among the commercial crops we raise, rye is the most susceptible, but it's also out there just in nature in the grasses in the ditch. And it's got mycotoxins in, so if you got too much of it, it's hard on the livestock and it's hard on people too. So that's the issue, is if it becomes negative if you're raising your grain for feed or for food use. And I'll just try and go over this real quick. It's favored by uneven stands because what happens is once it infects there, the initial stages of infection, it creates a honeydew that attracts insects. And they'll go to that and then they'll buzz around the field and spread it. So it can go from head to head once it gets started. So if you have a uniform stand and a variety that's all uniform, it all heads out at once, you've got a narrow window where it can move. If you've got an uneven stand, some's heading out early, some's heading out later, maybe a varietal mixture, maybe open pollinated VNS line or something where you got, a wide range in plants heading out, then it's got a lot of potential to move because it can get started in one place and go during that long window, can move around. So stand uniformity and variety selection are important. There's no effective fungicide treatments. You can treat seed, and that will, if it's ergot's in the seed you plant, you can put a seed treatment will help with that. But once you're in the crop stage of it, there's not a fungicide you can use. So your management is rotation first. You want to keep away from grasses the year before. Oats are not so bad, but wheat and barley would be a definite no-no. But just best if you're going to a broadleaf crop, if ergot's an issue, follow a broadleaf crop. You want to select less susceptible lines. Generally, your hybrid lines are less susceptible than the open pollinated ones from what we've seen. Start with clean seed. Stand uniformity is important. Control volunteer grasses that year before, because that's a reservoir for the ergot. And also, you might want to mow your ditches if they start to head out when the rye's heading out. Because if you've got brome grass in your ditch and it's heading out when the rye's heading out, you might have ergot in that brome that's going to move over. But if you're in South Dakota and you're by a state highway, you've got to think about the dates for that because there are restrictions there. But anyway, that's another thing to consider. If your soil is low in copper, that makes the plant more susceptible to ergot. And the threshold there that I can gather from the research I've looked at is about 0.4 to 0.5 parts per million copper. If you're below that, you're going to apply, and copper will help. And the response to copper for disease resistance is at a higher threshold than for yield response. So you might say, well, I put copper on my corn and I didn't get any yield response. And that may be true. And the rye may not need the copper for the yield, but its disease resistance is at a higher level. So for yield, you're looking at about 0.2 parts per million for most of our crops, based on SDSU recommendations. But for disease resistance in rye, you're looking at about 0.4 or 0.5 parts per million. Is where you want to draw the line. It may be worse around the edge of the field, so that's something you can scout for. And if you see you've got it around the edge of the field, but not in the middle, you might want to harvest the middle, keep it clean so you can market it. And then, you might, what you do with the outside, I don't know, depend on how bad it is and if you can get it cleaned up or if you have to destroy it. But that would be a consideration because the insects, if it's coming from the outside of the field, your edges may have a lot more ergot. And that way you can keep most of your stuff clean if that's the case. So it's something to scout for. And you want to follow it by checking what's in the grain. So if you're buying grain for your cattle or you're going to feed your own grain to your cattle, you want to check it out for ergot. Because if it gets too high, it is nasty, causes nasty problems. At a low level, it's not, it's like anything, the poison is in the dosage. But if there's too much of it, you don't want it. So you want to assess what you raise if you're going to feed it and what you buy. So you know where you're at. Okay. And Sarah was very kind to me. So I'm going to call it good there.
Any questions for Peter?
Yeah.
Fertility are you using for like?
Okay, for forage production, we haven't done a lot of trials with that. I would say though that you probably want to put about 30 pounds of nitrogen on in the fall. If you're going with a, you're looking for high production, you know, then, I would run, like for example, if you did the Hazlet, it would be 1.2 million seeds per acre. If you're running with a hybrid line, would be 800,000 seeds per acre. And then, I'd put about 30 pounds of nitrogen on and maybe 10 pounds of sulfur in the fall. And maybe just another 40 pounds on early in the spring. That's kind of a judgment call on my part. Now, if you're raising it for grain, and you're doing the hybrid lines, then you'd want to put, instead of 40 pounds on in the fall, in the spring, you'd want to put 80 pounds on if you raise a hybrid line for grain.
That's because you can have as much time as you'd like at the moment. So
Oh, really?
That's really scary, but yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
So what's the threshold for the like
Oh, you should ask Zach that. I'm just an agronomy guy. I'm not the livestock guy. But I think if I want to remember, I think in beef cattle, well, ask Zach. He's
What,
an
I'm here. What was that? I was
he's the next speaker.
just stepping
That's
away
a
to.
good question. My main point would be is it's like a lot of things. If you know it's there, you can manage for it. Right. So if you happen to have bad luck and you get a lot of ergot in your field, if you're aware of it, then you can think about, okay, maybe I want to spend extra money and get this cleaned with a color sorter or a gravity table, right? Or I'm going to have to dilute it. I can use it, but I'm going to have to keep it a low part of the ration. What you don't want to be in a situation where you don't realize it's there. And then you feed it and you, oh my gosh, you know, my cattle aren't doing very well. So the main thing is you're aware and you sample for it. And then from there you can manage it. But Zach would be the guy to tell you exactly, you know, how much is too much.
Yeah, Pete, that number, it's on total ergots. You know, we see physiological effects in cattle as low as 100 parts per billion total ergot inclusion, which even amongst the, you know, really clean rye, say if it's 200 parts per billion, if you include it at 50% of diet dry matter, which isn't our recommendation, you can start to see some effects. Our data is a little confounded by season. We've fed some really clean rye through winter. We've fed some hotter rye through summer months and did run into some issues. And I'm going to share some of that today in my talk.
So now is it a cumulative effect, Zach?
Yeah, Pete, I don't totally know that. Ergot in general, you know, mainly in beef cattle science, it's been primarily studied in cattle grazing tall fescue in the eastern and southeastern states, you know, Kentucky through South Carolina and down into Alabama. Most of those cattle are that are in that part of the world. It's cow-calf region, and so those cows do have repeated exposure to the ergot over time. And to some degree, you know, those stalker calves, depending upon when they're kicked out, are exposed to it. That's a good question on total ergot. I'll be honest, when we started this, we didn't worry about it. Thought it was clean. As we built up our repertoire of data in different harvest years, we've noted it's really quite variable. And in fact, most small grains, they need to be tested for ergot before you consider using them in a diet. Our recommendation on inclusion level will protect you pretty good because we're not saying to feed it at 60 or 70% of diet dry matter, but certainly a concern. And I'm sure Dr. Bob might have some stuff to talk about on that in regards to pigs as well. My cat's here.
Yeah. Okay. So I would just say to kind of boil that down to my perspective, Austin. So it's going to depend how much is in the ration and how long you feed it. But if you know what's in you can sort it out. the main thing is you don't want to be blindsided by it. Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to mention, I'm the nutritionist with PWS.
Okay.
From what we've seen, we generally would say.
Just a second. Let me give you the microphone. And introduce yourself a little bit for the people online.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Rundle, and I'm the livestock nutritionist for KWS. Hi, Zach. You're up on our screen here. I have a PhD in swine nutrition, but I've been working with Zach and Warren and Bob talking about all the trials at SDSU. A lot of our growers, if you look at your field and you see ergot hybridized red, but I'm not saying it's impossible. It just really depends on the growing conditions. But if you can see it in field, I would recommend doing a test, and anything under 0.9 parts per billion, we generally say it's okay because you're not feeding it 100% in the diet. And so when you dilute it down to about 40% in beef cattle, which is what Warren and Zach will probably present to you later, it is diluted in the diet. And so 0.2 parts per billion is what we say is okay, as Zach mentioned. Is that right?
It's 0.2 ppm. It's 200.
Yeah. Okay. Parts per million. Sorry.
Yep, that's right. I got, because my numbers are in parts per billion. They're
Yeah.
going to be to the tune.
Sorry. Parts per million.
You're good. Thank you.
There's problems with circulation. They kind of lose their tips of their ears, their tail, if it's high concentration in the feed. More than that more issues with a higher concentration, but under 0.2 parts per million, we have seen risk, but anything under that, we say it's generally okay.
It's a vasoconstrictor, everybody. It causes tightening of the blood vessels, doesn't allow blood flow to get to really the extremities are where we see it manifest its problems. So tail switches and hooves. And under high ambient temperatures is even more concerning. We end up having necrosis of those. And as Carly said, so 200 parts per billion or 0.2 ppm. We see some alterations in physiological effects as low as 0.1 ppm or 100 parts per billion. We've had rye come out of the field, Pete, from the 2019 growing season. I believe that's what it was. And though that stuff there was at about 273 parts per billion or 0.273 ppm. We really didn't have any trouble. The last study we ran, it was about 2,000 parts per billion. And when we diluted it down at the 18% inclusion, and I was just doing the math here, I'm going to double check myself, times 0.18. We were down there around 400 parts per billion or 0.4 ppm. And I did notice some effects, and I'll share that data today with everybody.
So,
Pete, what can you tell us about the 2022 grain year? Was it this would have been 2021 crop that we fed, I believe, last year. Was there anything different about that production year that differed from 19? I do know the stuff we got in 19 came out of Minnesota. The stuff we fed in 22 would have been the stuff we grew down there just northwest of the farm. When did we get that crop harvested?
that would have been harvested in July of 21. And we had a pretty good drought. I'm not sure about Matt Lowy's stuff that we bought from him. He's from further north of us, and they do pick up more moisture there. And generally, the more moisture you have, the more likely you are to have a problem with ergot.
Would we have fed Matt's stuff before the stuff y'all raised on the farm?
Most likely because his would have been dumped on the top of the bin. And that
Okay.
probably would have gone first.
Yep. Oh, hey, this makes the story even better, Pete, because
That's
we
my
need-
guess.
okay. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to make a note.
Okay, so the other thing I was going to just mention while we're on this vein is that, like, for example, now at our farm, we use winter rye as a cover crop all the time. That's just, we use it a lot. And we just get whatever's cheap and available, BNS rye, and cover a lot of our corn acres. And then we spray it out. If we happen to be in a place where we can graze it, we might graze it. But now going forward, because with this ergot and we were raising oats, and this is a long story, as a small grain, but we're going to switch that to hybrid rye. So we're planning to do a lot more hybrid rye in the future. So we'll probably put in winter wheat or winter triticale as a cover crop for future. So we're not putting down winter rye after corn, plant an early soybean line, and then go back with hybrid rye on that field, planting that in the fall where it had a winter rye cover crop the spring before, if you know what I mean. So that's another angle on it. The triticale and rye are susceptible to ergot, but much less than rye. So you want to create the longer the window you can create before you plant the rye, the better for keeping ergot out. Okay. I better give the microphone away before I
Fine.
get in trouble.
You're fine. All right. Well, thank you, Peter. There's, like I said, there's a lot of research going on at the Southeast Farm on rye, hybrid rye, as well as looking at rye for forage purposes. And that was just a snippet of it. Originally, a little insight. Originally, when we were planning this meeting, Peter was just going to talk about rye for grain. And then we just had a lot of information and questions coming in about forage rye. So he added that to his presentation and had to squeeze it all in. So I'm just impressed that he got through that much info in that time. Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Dr. Zach Smith. He is with the Department of Animal Science on campus at SDSU, and he also supervises the Ruminant Nutrition Center up near Brookings. He originally got his bachelor's in animal production from Texas Tech. If you notice the accent, we like to give him a hard time. His master's is in feedlot nutrition from SDSU, and then he went back and got a PhD in cattle nutrition from Texas Tech. You must have liked it warmer down there, Zach.
Yeah. It's my family.
Zach's got a 70-30 teaching research or research teaching appointment, excuse me. And Zach, I was just looking up a little bit of info on your lab because I couldn't remember what all you do. But the biggest thing I found was that in his lab, they work on nutrition management interventions that enhance growing and finishing beef mainly. And I'm sure there's more to it, but that was the pretty way that it was stated online. So I went with that. But Dr. Smith is a lot of fun. He's really great with questions and working with producers. So I know we're half online and half in person, but if you do have a question, we'll make sure we get to it. If you're online, don't be afraid to put your question in the chat, or you can speak up at the end since you all do have microphone privileges. So I won't waste any more time. I think Zach is also going to cover Dr. Warren Rushi's presentation. Dr. Rushi had a family matter, families first, so he was not available today. But I just want to give just a little bit of info about Dr. Rushi. I think Zach will probably kind of move into his info. They work together quite a bit. But Warren is our extension feedlot specialist on campus, and he was originally an extension field specialist working in cow-calf production. So he's got a lot of good background. I know he also in the past has worked and raised his own cow-calf operation as well. He has his bachelor's and PhD in animal science from SDSU, and he did get his master's at K-State. So he left for a little bit and came back, but we'll have Zach present some of his info as well. So Zach, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sarah. And I was hoping to be there today. Last night I planned on being there, and 7 a.m. this morning I got the email. I see Kelly's on here. Sioux Valley Schools went to an e-learning day, and they missed too many days with that weather stint back in December that they're doing e-learning. So I got Maddox over here e-learning as I am his instructor. And so I wasn't able to make it, and I'm sorry. And it's kind of been a snowball. Dr. Rushi, I'm covering for him. I owed him last year when our second kid was born. Warren really kept the shoelaces tied and kept us from tripping up. And I think, Sarah, last road show, we would have had a forage deal between you and with Mary down at UNL. And Warren had to cover for me because I had to run back to Texas for a family emergency. So we really, Warren and I worked together a lot. And so anything he was going to talk about, we'd been sitting in the office together talking about it. That's one of the best parts of this job is for me is getting to work with Warren. I mean, I consider Warren one of my best friends. He's a lot older than me. We always joke. He started grad school the day I was born back in 1990. But it's really fun to get to work with Dr. Rushi because, as Sarah said, he wears many caps. Okay. He was a state county extension agent and then went back to the family farm and came back as a cow-calf specialist. And more recently, he completed his PhD in the past 2 years. And Warren was actually my first PhD student. And the opportunity to get to work with a guy that's worn so many hats and has lived day-to-day life on a farm really helps out a young kid like me that I grew up in Central Florida going to skateboard parks. And so to have that experience and to keep me grounded is outstanding. And it makes work a lot of fun. Title of today's talk is more than a cover crop. I think this is, I always tell people we're working in rye and they say, that's a cover crop. I said, well, yeah, but there's some interesting things that we need to discuss here. Y'all can see my screen, I hope. I think, though, I could start off with a real cute slide talking about, and I got that one next. It's cute and wordy. But I think with anything, we need to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly because it's associated with most things in life. Obviously, the good benefits are what Pete had just discussed here a few minutes ago. These agronomic benefits that I'm not even going to try to talk about. I've got a few pictures on my phone of some old field alleys where they'd weed eat it, and you could see where the rye had been removed and the weed growth and all those things are fascinating. The ability to break that corn rootworm cycle and the ability to have a growing crop or some root mass in the ground over winter. And I'm certainly not an expert on those things, but as a beef cattle scientist, I reckon I understand. Yeah, Max. My son's over here asking me how to spell words. We got to keep it down. I certainly respect and understand those agronomic benefits that make this whole system work. Now, the bad, we figured this out pretty early, is you probably need to process the stuff, and we actually figured that out in experiment too. But the initial bad is that the equipment that we had to process our corn grain down at the Southeast farm was not adequate for rye. And as such, Brad went and found us a chicken feed grinder, and we were able to process our rye in the first experiment. So that's led us on to a series of experiments that we've worked to refine how rye should be processed. Not only us here in America, some scientists up in Canada are also working on some really interesting things in relation to rye processing. A lot of that work is just now getting published in the journals within the past 6 to 9 months, and a lot of it's mainly digestibility work. So small animal numbers, looking at things like digestive function and feeding behavior and various indicators of potential stress from blood metabolite type work. Didn't include any of that in the talk today, but very interesting stuff. And the ugly is that ergot is a concern. Wasn't a concern in our first experiment. That was, I don't know enough agronomically about all this stuff. That line was Bono. We didn't have a lot of ergot, and I don't know if it had something to do with the year. And then as we've moved forward, our colleagues down in Nebraska, Lincoln, have fed some hybrid rye. They ran into some issues with ergot contamination in their grain. It's hard to sometimes to figure out if it's the ergot or the level of processing. And then more recently this summer, we fed some rye in our processing study, and we did note some deleterious effects of ergot. And I'll present those data here just a bit. So the question is, all right. The question is why would you study anything other than corn in South Dakota? Right? Corn is king, generates more energy per acre than any other cereal grain that we use in modern production practices. Corn's highly productive. The genetics are ever increasing. There's a lot of different companies that allow you to select the specific germplasm that suits your operation. And a lot of these are more regional, and it's a finely tuned system. We know what it takes to produce corn. It's like a Formula One race car. I think that when you look at some of these years, it always blows my mind that, Mother Nature always bats last, is what Warren says. But some of these corn genetics have figured out how to grow on just the right amount of rain at the right time, right? What I think is a drought, growing up in Texas, and then I spend a year in South Dakota and it rains a lot. And then the next year it doesn't feel like it rains a lot, but we just get the most timely rains at the most perfect time. We end up with outstanding corn yield. So it's a finely tuned system with productive genetics at work. Now we got to remember that popular does not always equal perfect, okay? And monocultures and of grain over time can do things that decrease soil organic matter and cause disease pressure. Particular extended diapause corn rootworm, resistant weeds, and overall impacts on soil health and system resiliency. Now, when we talk about rye as a cattle-free grain, really in any instance, having an opportunity to get rid of a particular feedstuff is through livestock channels is really important to the success of that crop. And this is when the higher markets get saturated. If one is selling OP rye, the opportunity to sell that rye as seed for the cover crop industry is certainly valuable. And also, if it's clean enough, into the culinary market. With hybrid rye, the culinary market is likely your first avenue. But if that doesn't work out, then we need to figure out a way for Dr. Toller and myself and Dr. Rushi to move this through livestock. A lot of the information is very old, 1930s and more recently in the 1980s. In fact, you look back to the data in the 1930s, Dr. Toller, there's an old livestock report that I found done right here at the South Dakota station where they were feeding rye to cattle. And then they were running pigs behind the cattle to eat all the whole rye out of their feces. Talk about regenerative agriculture and a building of a system. That was it. We did that 100 years ago. old open pollinator rye, due to its inability to super pollinate and outcompete that ergot, resulted in higher concentrations of ergot alkaloids compared to new germplasms. And much, if not all of this work originally was done prior to the adoption of corn crop processing co-products, namely those that are wetter products like modified or wet distillers grains that provide a very nice diet conditioning attribute and can help bind up fines and loose particles. So our first question is, will the cattle eat it? How will the cattle perform? And then what is the apparent net energy value of hybrid rye so that we can help producers make better recommendations of how to include it? Because really in livestock production, there's lots of risk, but it's all about being able to predict what you got. When you feed cattle, being able to know what they're going to do is a very valuable tool. Even if you know they're going to do poorly, knowing how they will perform is really important when we talk about managing risks. And so we set out to determine the net energy value. So we've done quite a bit of work with rye. We've set out this project now has been going on for 3 years, and we're not done. We still have ideas on our tool belt. A lot of this work has been supported in part or fully by KWS and to some degree our own work here. And this is an avenue and research that we're going to continue to work in. The first study was merely a dose titration study where we wanted to replace rolled corn with rolled rye. After that, had some leftover rye and a grad student that needed a project and some spare cattle. And we wanted to look at what happened if we replaced our standard grain, rolled corn, completely with whole rye. Because as I've already mentioned, some of those aspects of processing that rye were quite difficult. That rye seed or berry, I grew up around a lot of sorghum, called them berries, would fall right through the roller mill. And so being able to manage that, we know we're not going to feed it as a complete replacement of corn. We need to figure out how to optimize our equipment and production system. And then more recently, we figured out that 1/3 replacement of the grain with rye is really a great blend. We talk about associative effects. I'll discuss those in a second. We were like, okay, well, what's the discount if we don't do anything? We'll just feed it whole, right? We grew a bunch. We sold as much as we could to the culinary market. Now we need to feed this to our livestock. And it's really an opportunity type of a grain buy to use. And so what just happens if we just put it in the diet? The other treatment was, okay, what happens if we dry rolled it? And then the third option was, well, what if we just got grandpa's old grinder mixer hog feed from the 1980s and we just took a stab at it with that? So really very applied and very driven to things that our stakeholders might see when they're trying to implement the use of this novel cereal grain into their livestock feeding operations. So experiment one, this was a part of Dr. Rushi's dissertation work. We conducted this at the Southeast Research Farm down there at Beersford back, would have started about October of 2019. We had 4 treatments, basal diet, had 60% rolled corn, and then we incrementally traded out rolled corn for rolled rye until we had completely replaced the corn grain with rye. And so base diet, 20% rye, 40% rye, or 60% rye. These were big, I say big, they were big green cattle. They didn't weigh a lot, but boy, were they green. Cattle coming off grass. We'd have purchased these in late September, early October of 2019. We had 24 pens total, okay, and 10 steers per pen and 6 pens per treatment. So good amount of replication and really well designed and strong for this type of research. Here's the final diet composition. As you can see here, we replaced rye, corn with rye. So we had a complete replacement of rolled rye with corn. Modified distillers grains was included, about 19% of diet dry matter. These diets were roughage component was based upon corn silage, so about 8% roughage equivalent here. So it's a 92% concentrate diet. And then a liquid supplement that would have contained vitamins, minerals, and monensin to those diets. As you can see here, we weren't trying to be ISO crude protein, right? We said, this is more of a systems approach. We're just gonna keep the same basal diet. We could have gotten real cute and confounded things with removing modified distillers to keep the crude protein the same. But we said, you know what? If someone's got this on their farm, they're probably just gonna keep doing what they always did and feed it. Now, does this open up opportunities for other research? If we feed more crude protein from rye, could we discount some of the distillers grains? And yeah, that's certainly an option. And then as you can see here, as we increase the amount of rye in the diet, we increase the fiber content, the neutral detergent fiber, and reduced the tabular net energy value of the diet. So here's what happened to dry matter intake during the first, throughout the entirety of the study. Real quickly here to orientate you, on the y-axis, we have intake in pounds per head per day, and then days on feed. what I have here are probability values for the interaction between treatment and day, and then the effective day and the effective treatment. Now, when we have an interaction here, that means that on different days, treatment means actually differ. The day effect tells us that as days on feed increased, intake increased, and that treatment effect tells us that the treatments did differ. But since we have that interaction, what we're really interested here is on what days did these differ. And really through day 47 of the study, there was no difference in dry matter intake. However, feed intake diverged later in the feeding period as we increased the amount of rye, such that cattle fed the complete replacement actually had lower dry matter intake than all other treatments those last 2 to 3 weeks. And the rolled corn diet had the greatest intake level throughout the study. Now, we were really curious as to why did rye decrease intake in this particular study. I think early on, what I think we've come to find out after we did the second study is that it could potentially have been a function of increasing fines. Rye, when it's rolled, it breaks into 4 or 5 pieces, but it also can produce a little bit of flour. Those fines can be detrimental. The fine particles can be detrimental to intake. Early on in the step-up period, we would have been feeding more forage, and potentially the greater amount of forage in that diet, coupled with the fineness of the grain, might have attenuated that reduction in intake because we were just feeding a bit more forage. Now, as we got to the final diet that only had an 8% roughage equivalent, then the fine particles were more readily able to express their apparent negative effect on dry matter intake of those cattle. Now, here's carcass adjusted final body weight. As we increased the level of rye in the diet, we linearly decreased outweight. And this was appreciably different. Went from 1432 to 1367. But interestingly, though, cattle fed 20% of rye in replacement of corn, so 1/3 rye in the diet, had nearly identical out body weight as the cattle fed a complete replacement of corn. Dressing percent differed, likely a function of the fiber in the rye. And if you all can remember, December of 2019 was not a normal December. It was really mild. Pen conditions really were getting out of condition down at Beersford due to the amount of moisture we received and the fact that it just didn't spend a lot of days below freezing. And so we had quite a bit of mud and hide tag accumulation on these cattle, such that even on that day, the plant where we got these harvested had slowed their rail down about 15% per hour to keep things clean. So yes, lower dressed yield than we typically see in cattle, even for the control, a function likely of the mud, pen conditions down at that time. But the treatment effects are most likely a function of the increased amount of fiber found when rye is fed. On this graph here, I have average daily gain, feed conversion, and some math we call the associative effect math. As you can see here, as we, let me see, can y'all see my laser pointer? I hope so.
Yes.
As we increase the amount of rye, we linearly decreased average daily gain to the tune of about 15 to 20%. Cattle fed 1/3 rye in replacement of corn had a very similar average daily gain. And then dry matter feed conversion was increased by about 10%. It was 10% poorer in the complete replacement compared to the control. That 1/3 rye group was nearly identical to the control. Now, one thing in animal feeding is this is actually this is free. You get to walk and chew your gum too, is associative effects of feeding grain. And oftentimes we forget about this because within our system, our finely tuned system of feeding a bunch of corn, we forget about the benefit of blending 2 grain sources with varying different starch fermentation profiles in the rumen. All right, so the old school example was comparing Milo to rolled corn, rolled Milo to rolled corn. Rolled Milo alone is pretty poor compared to rolled corn on feed efficiency. When you fed the two together, the average of those two was considerably better than I got to grab my computer. Was considerably better than those fed in. Sorry, working from home is a mess. And so when we fed rye as a partial replacement 1/3, we had about a 3% improvement in what we call the associative effect math. The greater levels, that associative effect was even less. Now, rye did not affect quality grade distribution. We had no deleterious effects on the proportion of cattle grading prime, premium choice, choice, or select, nor did we have any effects on the distribution of quality grades. Rye did not affect liver abscess prevalence and scores, and this was a concern because rye is much like wheat, is pretty rapidly fermented in the rumen. So we wanted to test and make sure that feeding more rapidly fermented grain didn't affect liver outcomes. For every liver abscess, that liver is not able to be sold to our global beef partners. And Egypt buys the majority of the U.S. livers from fed beef cattle. If we have different levels of severity of liver abscesses, if that abscess is open, they condemn the entire gut mass plus any trim on the carcass that needs to occur. Can range from $50 to $100 per head just from the loss of the drop value. Liver abscesses in general are about a $500 million problem to U.S. cattle feeding industry. So we wanted to know this. Increasing rye, we had less ribeye area, and we had a lighter weight at which they would have been at a similar degree of fatness. And talk a little bit about this. It could be a function of a reduction in RUP content, but we're not thinking this is the problem. Rye did reduce dressing percent, but overall, as I mentioned, the whole group of cattle dressed poorly, likely a function of the greater amount of fiber in the rye cattle. So we calculated the apparent net energy value of rye based upon these studies. At 1/3 replacement of corn grain with rye had a net energy value of 94 and 64. And the complete replacement here was 86 and 56. And in fact, this tracked very closely with current tabular estimates that we had for open pollinator rye. And so there is no apparent energy benefit to hybrid rye. It's still carbs, fat, protein, much like open pollinator rye, but there is less risk for ergot. And that's the benefit here. So the current estimates for rye based upon the nutrient requirement model in Dr. Preston's tables are 89 or 86 and 59 or 56. As you can see here, our values tracked really nicely with Dr. Preston's values. So why was dry matter intake reduced? Was it an effective processing? As you can see here, I'm kind of tying together mine and Warren's talk all into one. Excess fines reduce intake of cattle fed barley. Barley's, as you know, is another small grain that, much like rye and wheat, is very rapidly fermented. Has to do with the proportion of starch to prolamine and how that starch matrix is encapsulated within the grain. And this stuff, just think of corn as diesel or kerosene, and think of the small grains as jet fuel whenever you drop it in the rumen. The effective ergot alkaloids in this experiment were 0, 78, 157, or 235 parts per billion from rye. And so I'm going to have to lock him in his room next time I try to do this. I'm sorry. And so as we fed more rye, we got up above that 0.2 part per million level. And so was it a function of fines? Was it a function of ergot? We still don't totally know, but well, we do after I did the second study. I'll share that effect. Matthews and others down in under grazing tall fescue had noted that they had intake effects at levels as low as 120 parts per billion, or 0.12 ppm, which is about half of what Dr. Rundle had mentioned was an issue. Is their recommendation. Then we asked whether, did we have a metabolizable protein deficit? As I noted, we observed reduced feed intake, which is a hallmark function of an improper balance in metabolizable protein supply. And we had lower body weight at which they were finished. Rye is very low in rumen undegradable protein, but according to the NASEM model, we were adequate in MP supply. But maybe our assumptions were incorrect in the proportion of the crude protein that was ruminally or ruminally undegradable. This is a constant battle with the beef cattle finishing. I got a different number than Warren, who's got a different number than his buddy. They're good, educated guesses at best. So a follow-up study to this was conducted by Ellie Buckhouse, a master's student of mine at the Ruminant Nutrition Center. We used the same rye as experiment 1, so I knew we didn't have an ergot issue. That rye was pretty clean. It had 392 parts per billion. I got it on a later slide, total. We fed 56 yearling heifers with 4 replicate pens per treatment for 90 days. Basal diet, 60% grain, 20% co-product, 10% roughage, and the balance was a supplement. We fed rye. It was unprocessed, complete replacement of corn. And to just get to the data real quick, we had lesser cumulative gain and poorer feed efficiency. But in this particular study, the rye cattle tended to eat more. All right. So it wasn't an ergot problem. It was likely a grain processing problem. As we fed more rye, replacement of corn, and we processed it, we think it had something to do with the level of fines in the diet that resulted in some degree of digestive upset. And in this particular study, we estimated that the NE value of unprocessed rye was 21% less than corn and 9% less than processed rye. And if you remember, you go back here, on average, processed rye has an NE value about 10% less than rolled corn. And this difference between unprocessed and processed rye tracks really nicely with what we see in other small grains. Unfortunately, in the beef cattle nutrient requirement model, we don't have a degree of processing effects on energy values like we do corn. So corn's got a value for flake corn, rolled corn, hulled corn, tempered corn. With small grains, it's just wheat or barley or rye. And so you really got to dig into the data to see those effects when we process a small grain and feed it to livestock. These are the data. There was no difference in initial body weight, but really everything was significant in the complete replacement with whole rye. As you'll see here, though, through the cumulative finishing phase, these cattle ate a lot. They ate a lot more than the controls, but had poorer gain and considerably worse feed conversion. And they performed about 7% poorer than what I had anticipated them when I didn't process the rye. Additionally, rye altered hot carcass weight and yield grade, and those were the mean values, but didn't move the needle on the distribution of yield and quality grade, much like the first study. So at a full replacement, the net energy value of unprocessed rye is about 10% less than processed rye. And that tracks. It fits my bias and it fits what we've seen in the literature for things like barley and wheat. So we're really comfortable telling you that, yeah, you can do this. If you get it bought on the cheap or you produced it, it can work. But the next study is where we were trying to figure out how to optimize processing level relative to what our recommendation is to how you should feed it. So this follow-up study that occurred last spring, we would have started this study in about March, late March, early April. We used 192 steers, came out of a backgrounding yard. they were bigger. They weren't grass cattle that intended for grass. They weighed about 900 pounds. We had 24 pens total, 6 pens per treatment. We fed these cattle for about 140, well, not about, we fed them for 147 days through the heat of July and into early August. And boy, was it ever hot. June to July was miserable. I'd never seen Scott so happy to like see a load of steers leave that feedlot. He worked his tail off, watering them, keeping them hot. They were black-hided cattle. It wasn't perfect, the weather by any means, and I'm sure many of you all remember that. 60% grain. We included a basal diet completely based upon rolled corn. And then the other diets were 1/3 rye, 2/3 rye. And these ergot levels here were based upon an initial sample, but I've got new data, so ignore that. We fed whole, we dry rolled it to a processing index of 82%. The first study, our processing index was 78%. And a processing index is simply processed test weight divided by unprocessed test weight. It's as you process it, bulk density changes, and this is a way we track our degree of processing. Or we hammer milled it. This was the old attempt to use Grandpa's old grinder mixer to pretty much take a whack at this stuff. And what we ended up making was half flour, half untouched rye. Is pretty much what we ended up making. Brad would have to tell you the size of the screen. I should know. It's in a notebook somewhere. But if anyone has any questions on how we did that, Mr. Bradley will be able to help you out with that. So to move into these data here, this would have been initial body weight was similar, out body weight didn't appreciably differ significantly, nor did average daily gain, but intake level did. Okay, so intake level was greater for whole rye and hammer milled rye than rolled corn, and the least for dry rolled rye. Dry matter feed conversion did not differ between the rolled corn and the dry rolled rye, but was increased for the whole rye and the hammer milled rye compared to those other two treatments. And then if you take a look here, got different effects. This is the effect of rye. So at 1/3 replacement, no matter what the processing method was, rye in the diet competed comparable to corn. Processing effects, this is a bit skewed because the hammer milled rye really didn't do any better, but dry rolled rye was better than whole rye from a feed conversion perspective. This here is, we call this the observed to expected values. If cattle grow to their genetic potential and environmental conditions are not so poor, which this is over a 147-day feeding period. Like when I went and looked at the time between June and July, it was horrible for everybody. Okay, but overall, they really performed closely. So here, this a ratio of 1 means that the observed cattle performance that we saw matches with what they should have done based upon their intake level and the energy content of the diet fed. But as you can see here, corn was pretty much 1. Rolled rye was 2% better than I anticipated. And hammer milled rye was 2% worse, and whole rye was about 3% worse. Here is what we ended up calculating. The apparent net energy value for whole rye was 51. For hammer milled rye, it was 52. And for dry rolled rye, it was about 67. So dang near the energy value of corn. Under that situation, and I'll explain it, it's not the same as corn. It appears that way whenever you feed it at 1/3 of the diet because of the associative effects of feeding those two different starch fermentation profiles. Really, in this particular study, we're going to go fast. There was no effect on any carcass traits for anything measured except that dressed yield tended to be altered for rolled rye, but can't I don't have a good explanation as to why that occurred. Sometimes random gets you. Conclusion: processing effects. It's important to know that processing is probably the way to go. If you can't process it, you're feeding it a third of the diet. Depend upon diet cost. It's not the end of the world. In experiment 3, the apparent energy value was about 6% greater than experiment 1. 1/3 of the grain in the diet is rye with 2/3 grain, creates this positive associative effect that literally can't explain this to your banker, but is better than it was supposed to be because of those varying fermentation profiles of those two different grains. And what happened in experiment 1 versus 2? That reduction in intake had to do at the complete replacement, likely due to fines associated with processing method. Because in experiment 2, when we fed whole rye, they ate more. And then hammer milled falls somewhere in between. When we hammer milled it, they ate more, but they ate more and didn't always gain as well. So this was a total ergot parts per billion on a dry matter basis from experiment 1 and 2. There's only 392 parts per million. And I showed you all those levels, whether we fed it at 20, 40, or 60%. We went from 78 to 48 to about 240 parts per billion in the diet. We fed these cattle through winter, and we noted no apparent issues with ergot susceptibility in those cattle. Now, experiment 3, I told you the data was updated. That first sample was literally a spot sample of one of the first loads or later load, just something we grabbed one day to know where we were at. The mean ergot level in experiment 3, the processing study, was 2,237 parts per billion, or 2 parts per million. The standard deviation was really big. It bounced all over the place. So it's highly variable. And the CV was even worse, okay? Typically, a coefficient of variation, I'm looking for 10%. That means that it didn't go, that wasn't the case here. The whole rye in that study averaged 663 parts per billion. The hammer milled and the rolled rye was 2,537 or 3,361 parts per billion. Now, to tell y'all what happened here, we had to get our processing equipment from the stakeholder that allowed us to use it and get all of our processing done at once. So the hammer milled and rolled rye were both the early rye out of the bin, which would have been the rye that Pete, and I got to confirm this for sure because it's all too good to be true. It's tracking too good. We got to confirm this. Would have been the rye from the wetter crop. Okay, the stuff we got off of the farm close by to the facility. The whole rye was just stuff we took out of the bin as we needed more. All right, so that's why I think these data are noisy. And when we got these data back, Warren and I were like, geez, man, we're confounded by processing method. And we are, but I think we've figured it out now. That rye that we processed the first week of the study was the stuff we got locally from the neighbor. The whole rye would have been the stuff grown under different environmental conditions, potentially that didn't have as wet a growing season. So the average of the whole rye ergot was considerably less, nearly 80 to 75% less than the other groups. UNL did a study looking at steam flaked rye versus steam flaked corn. They too fed rye, hybrid rye. It was pretty hot with ergot, total ergot. And in this particular study, they were feeding it at either a 0, 50, 75%, up to maybe, I think that's where they stopped, replacement of rolled corn. So these diets on an average might have had 1735 or 52% rye included in the diet. And so even on 50 is 9. So they would have been somewhere around 400, 700, or 900 parts per billion. And they actually noted they were feeding these cattle over the summer, and they had to change their inclusion level because the ergot was a concern. They noted in this study poor feed conversion as they took more corn out, flake corn, and replaced it with rye. It decreased marbling scores, rib fat thickness, and ribeye area due to those impacts on performance. But at the end, when it was all said and done, steam flaked rye had about 92% the energy value of corn, steam flake corn, which is about what we said rolled rye had compared to rolled corn. Okay, and typically speaking, steam flaking grains doesn't enhance the apparent energy value of that particular feedstuff.
Zach,
All
we're
right.
running out of time.
Okay. Oh, good, because I'm almost done. I'm sorry. I told you I told you I'd be close. So this was something I noted in June when we went and weighed the cattle. I was like, these dudes look red. They look red colored. And it was by pen. And I finally went and grabbed my camera and I was like, I got to take pictures of this. I said, this is not really data, but pictures are worth 1,000-word type deal. You can see here control cattle, really clean hair coat, all black. That's mud on their hind end. But these cattle fed rye had a lot of what I'd call hard, long hair. Okay, long red hair. And here's another one. You can see some of that red, hard hair. Some of them had it a lot worse than others. Well, ergot bodies actually increase prolactin levels in circulation, which can affect the cattle's ability to shed their hair. This is one of the problems they note when they graze beef cows on tall fescue out in the bluegrass states, is that cows don't shed their hair. All right, so the American Angus Association has something they call hair shedding score. And so I told the grad students, I said, well, we're not going back to Brookings until we go and hair score every one of these critters on this facility. And so I did. So hair growth related to ergot becomes an issue in hair shedding. So as you can see here, shed score 1 is clean. Shed score 5 means they're really not shedding a lot of hair. And the dry rolled corn cattle, not fed much ergot, if any, had a greater proportion of shed scores 1 and 1 compared to the cattle fed rye. Now within the rye groups, there was a shift in the distribution to fewer cattle with scores 1 and 1, and a greater proportion of cattle with shed scores 4 and 5. And this actually tracks quite well with the ergot concentrations I showed you all on the slide before. This is really interesting data when it all lines up and smells right. And so we're really excited to be able to share this with you all. So the conclusion of today's talk is that 1/3 of the grain, or 15 to 20% inclusion, with the 20% corn co-product that's half water, modifieds, really does not create issues with fines. Future studies we're going to look at are the effect of tempering rye. You know, we've got an idea of, I don't know how this would work in winter months, unless you got a heated shop, but could Farmer Joe go and put rye in his mixer wagon, put water in there, let it temper overnight, unload it, and then not have to process the stuff? We also are interested in associative effects based upon processing index level. You know, if we make flour or not, what happens to those apparent associative effects? Lower concentrations of ergot alkaloids can impact physiology, growth, and intake. We're not sure what the upper limit is relative to where things go south. You know, I saw those cattle change their hair color. Some of them looked like they were walking on eggshells because they had tender feet. But in general, growth performance wasn't appreciably hurt in that particular study. So more to be determined, but we wanted to be forthcoming with our stakeholders on. We didn't want them to see what we saw and not be like, well, why didn't y'all say anything type deal. I got to thank my team. I'm the scientific leader. Dr. Rushi is our outreach and stakeholder engagement leader. Paul's Ruminant Nutrition Center manager here in Brookings. Jason handles all of the analytical work, wet chemistry that comes from both of the feedlots, the one in Brookings, the one in Beersford. Scott Bird and really Pete and Brad and the whole crew down at Southeast Farm, they help us run that like a fine machine. My graduate students, Tommy's working on his PhD at Michigan State, Montana State, excuse me. Santana's going out to Montana State to do a PhD. Tommy's our livestock judge and coach. He's wrapping up his master's degree. Erin's wrapping up her PhD. Chiago just started his PhD, and Forrest is wrapping up his PhD. We've got 2 other students that have joined us, Becca and Cassidy. Becca's a PhD student. Cassidy's an MS student. And I love this picture because this was February 7th down in Beersford. And it just goes to show you South Dakota's a crazy son of a gun, because we were down there in T-shirts dang near that day. No gloves on, doing a water trial in the middle. And these kids have been here for, at this point, 24 hours. We'd been there nonstop doing a pretty intensive study. And so they make work a lot of fun. If you're going to contact me, my email is easy, zachary.smith@sdstate.edu. If I got time, I'll entertain questions if that's okay.
I tell you what, because we're
Okay, and I apologize for Maddox here being a motor mouth while I was working.
it's okay, Zach. I think everyone understands. We all lived through 2020, and I have a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, and they're a lot of help.
Yeah. And hey, if they want to email me questions, Sarah, I know I took a little bit of time. I should have been faster. I did too much storytelling.
That's okay. Well, I think what we'll do is, for the people in the room and everyone online, we'll just plan to take a 5-minute break, and people that have questions can ask them as we take the break. And if someone has questions online, you can just send a chat directly to Zach if you go to the chat box or get our attention. So why don't we just take a quick 5-minute break so that we can stay a little close to time. Feel free, if you're in the room, there's bathrooms down the hallway, I believe. And there's some coffee and cookies over here and some literature. And if you're online and you need to stretch your legs, you can do that. And while we have the break, does anyone have any questions for Zach? And feel free to get up if you want, if you don't have questions.
And I'm watching the chat box too. So
Okay. You must have said it all. I'm not seeing anything right now.
this is a first.
That's good. That's a good sign. All right. We'll take a quick 5-minute break. If you think of a question, feel free to ask
I'm going to
him.
be sitting here.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. That was great. Zach, can you stop share, please?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Nope, it's fine. Thank you.
There you go.
Hey, Zach, this is Jack.
Hey, how are you, sir?
I'm good. In my economics, I didn't put any of the feeding economics in it. We're going to look more at just the growing part of it. So that'll be something, and you're showing it in your advantages to gaining and that type of stuff. But we might want to do costs of what it is for growing and then feeding.
Yeah. Well, and I think we'll circle Warren back around on this, and I think some sort of total systems cost analysis and options of grow X amount of bushels.
Right.
What are you going to sell? What proportion are you going to keep? Jack, we did a thought experiment, and I'm going to pull up the slide because I'm going to screw it up. Warren did a thought experiment years ago now, and was talking about the 1,200 acre South Dakota farmer that did corn and soybeans. Have you seen that slide before? And so they were,
yeah.
Okay,
I don't know that I have.
600 acres of beans, 600 acres of corn, and we talked about the corn yield. I'm going to pull it up while I got a second.
I'll have that too. That's what I did and used some data from Pete and
So you have that info, because what
Yeah,
it ended
Dwayne
up being
Beck.
was,
I just kind of modeled him on a 2,000 acre farm and then different rotations. So,
okay,
yeah.
I'm excited to
So
see
I
it.
think
What
we'll
we ended
kind of
up-
get to that same thing, really. So
what
that's
we
good.
ended up seeing on our thought experiment was we ended up with the yield and the boost in corn yield, no appreciable influence in beans, but adding that rye, really all it changed in the yearly workload was getting rye planted after corn silage. And then you take it as grain, you get straw that time of the year when you need it, you get to apply manure. The amount of grain we produced with the rye was about enough rye to feed 1/3 rye, 2/3 corn on that farm. And
Okay.
now if you just wanted to grow more grain, then you plant more corn, but it ignored all those agronomic benefits that Pete talks about. I'm excited to see your talk. That's what the redneck nutritionist came up with, though. So
It sounds
excited to see
good.
you.
So
Ah,
the
man,
redneck
thanks a lot.
economist will help with that. So it sounds
Right
good.
on. That's good. Where are you from, Jack?
I work out of the Mitchell office.
Okay.
So yeah, with the SDSU.
Where are you from originally then?
Yeah, right. I'm right close to home. So
Okay.
right from about 30 miles from where I grew up. So
Cool. Well, it's nice to meet you. I know I've been here a while. I need to get out and travel the state a little.
so back to you, Sarah. Questions?
All right. I think we're getting ready to sit down here in just a minute or so. I'll pull up Dr. Toller's PowerPoint and we will start with him in just a minute. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started and there'll be time. I just want to make sure we kind of stay on track in case people need to sign off or go home. But there'll certainly be time to talk with one another at the end here as well. So again, we just want to make sure that in case you have to leave early, we thank our sponsors, Yankton Seed House. If you get a chance, be sure to stop and talk to them. As well as Millborn Seed. They're not able to be here, but if they have, I'm sure if you have any questions for them, Justin Frichte or Colin Geppert would be probably the people to talk to. And then of course, we just want to make sure we give some recognition to SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education. David Karki and Amanda Bachman are our local reps, and David Karki is online today. He's up in Watertown, and he said there's just no way he was going anywhere from Watertown. I know it's pretty bad up there. So our next speaker is Dr. Bob Toller. He's hiding a little bit. And so Dr. Toller is originally from Wagner, actually. Are you coming tomorrow? Oh, perfect. He's going to be there tomorrow too. And he's a professor of animal science. His bachelor's and master's are from SDSU, and he got his PhD at K-State in swine nutrition and immunology as well, right? Yep. And he does, I think a little interesting fun fact about Dr. Toller is that he does quite a bit of study abroad. I know he started a couple classes at SDSU, and I think 2 of them, right, are traveling to China and one of them is traveling to Vietnam. Oh. Yeah. So quite a bit of international experience. I know Dr. Toller got a distinguished award last year as well. So he's been with the university for 34 years. That's some dedication. So we're just going to keep him. As long as he'll stay, we're going to keep him. He's a lot of fun to work with. And I'm going to turn this over to him. He is the guy. If you have swine questions, Dr. Toller is the guy to talk to. So hopefully we can all work together and figure this rye thing out. So I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Sarah. So how many people in the room are pig people? All right, good. That's all the good looking people. So sorry about the rest of you. So we'll keep this a little light. So as we I just want to, so we've done a couple trials, and actually that's Caitlin Sullivan, one of my grad students, so she's done all the work. But so when we look at hybrid rye in diets, why is the interest, right? Increase, and that's what we're all talking about, sustainability. Is the sustainability thing a real deal, or is it just kind of a fad? What do you guys think? Some people think it's real. How many think it's the kind of fad that we're going to work with? You know, I give you two examples, right? Super Bowl commercials. There was more electric car commercials than Bud Light commercials. So that means we've had a little bit of shift there. What's the Gevo plant? What's Gevo? You're nodding. What's that? Nope, actually, it's the one up in Lake Preston. It's that $1 billion carbon neutral ethanol plant, right? They're going to use for aviation fluid. And, you know, talking to people that build it, they're looking at putting 3 or 4 more up. So all of a sudden, if you can put up $1 billion plant in Lake Preston to get carbon neutral aviation fluid fuel, sustainability is here to stay. Okay, so again, why are we looking at it? Well, actually, it's really popular in Western Europe. I mean, their growing conditions and seasons a little bit differently, so they're going to plant a lot more small grain, more barley, more hybrid rye, those kinds of things. And we look at it, 80% of a swine diet is going to be corn. So it's got, you'll see in a little bit similar feeding value. And the other thing that I think, as you know, we've kind of gotten this corn soybean rotation, right? And the nice thing about it is if you add that third crop to it, it does a couple things. First of all, it's going to spread out the harvest. We've had these last couple of years, we've had some good falls, right? The weather's been good, harvest's been good. But what happens if we get a wet fall? And all of a sudden you're going from starting in the middle of September, beans, and trying to get corn done. That's a pretty small window. The nice thing is if you can put some of your fields into something like hybrid rye, all of a sudden now those acres can be combined in August, and that gives you a bigger window. The other thing that we see is if you get the hybrid rye off in August, all of a sudden now you can start putting manure on there in August instead of having to wait till the corn is out in November. And again, depending on the year, that is really a huge thing. I know some pork producers in the Clear Lake area plant wheat just for that reason, because it gives them an opportunity to get the manure put on there. So as we look at hybrid rye, a couple things. So there's 2 things that we look at, right? Would be protein. So hybrid rye actually is about 3% higher in protein, but really pigs don't require protein. They require individual amino acids, and lysine is the most important one. And actually that's pretty high. And when you look at the available lysine, again, that's higher than corn. So that's good. The other thing though is take a look at energy. So hybrid rye is going to be a little bit lower in energy. So the 3 most expensive things in a swine diet are going to be energy, phosphorus, and amino acids. But it's going to be a little bit lower in energy, and that's really for 2 reasons. So if you look at fat, that's what ether extract is. It's about 2 percentage points lower than corn, and this would be fiber, and it's quite a bit higher in fiber. So that's why it's lower in energy. But one of the good things when we talk about being lower in fat, we look at the fat in corn, and it's going to be an unsaturated oil. And you can get soft bellies that way, and versus in hybrid rye, it's not. Okay, so we did 2 trials. We did a smaller one at the Southeast Farm in 2021, 20 pigs, 5 pigs per pen. And we weren't brave enough to go 100% early on. So phase 1 was from 90 to 140 pounds. And it was either 100% corn, 83% corn, 17% rye, 2/3 corn, 1/3 rye, or 50-50. And then when we looked at the last 2 phases, it was either 100, 2/3, 1/3, 1/3 and 2/3, or 100% rye. And again, thank you KWS for helping us with that trial as well. Okay, and so this is going to be the first phase, right? And so it's going to be 0, 17, 33, and 50% rye in that first phase. We look at average daily gain. We saw no difference there. We looked at average daily feed intake, no difference there. And we looked at feed efficiency. It was all identical. So in that first phase, really a grower phase, we can go to 50% rye in a diet, not affect pig performance at all. Okay, so now it changes a little bit, right? So blue is going to be 0% rye, 33, 67, and finally on the right is going to be 100%. We look at that second phase from 140 to 210. Same thing, no difference in gain, no difference in feed take, no difference in feed efficiency, which works out pretty well. That last phase, no statistical difference in gain. We saw a bump in feed intake at the end with 100% rye, which means we ended up with a little bit poor feed efficiency. But again, when you're looking at economics, you need to look at that whole phase, that whole period, right? So from 90 to 265 pounds, there was no difference in gain, no difference in feed intake, but just at the end, that one at 100% was a little less efficient. So that was kind of interesting, right? So one of the things that we get criticized at the university for, and rightfully so, you know, so we got 5 pigs per pen, right? And what's it going to be in a commercial barn? You know, you might have 25 pigs per pen. There's a lot of guys that have gone to large pens with 100 pigs per pen. So how does that equate? And we know from experience it doesn't. So we use these small pens to kind of get an idea, beta test it. Is this a good idea or not? And then we're going to go to a larger barn. And so, oh, sorry, should have mentioned this, I forgot. So we talked about that difference in feed efficiency, right? Okay, how big a deal is that? So corn, we're looking at 174 pounds a gain. And with that 3.45 feed efficiency, that means that's going to take about 600 pounds of feed, right? Okay, corn, 80% of a swine diet is going to be corn. So that's going to be 480 pounds of corn, which is going to be 8.57 bushels. And I use the USDA price on Monday for corn in Southeast South Dakota, $7.12 a bushel. So basically, in this trial, we had about $61 worth of corn. Okay, so we had good feed efficiency. Let's take a look at rye. We had the same 174 pounds of gain. And if we take a look at that, we needed 512 pounds of rye, which is 9.4. So again, poor feed efficiency. We needed a little bit more rye than we did of corn. But if you put it on an equal price basis, so 712 corn would be equal to 668 rye. So again, anytime that selling price of rye in this situation is below 668, it's going to be more economical. Okay. And so I think that right with today's prices, it works out really pretty well. The other thing I want to, before we forget, we talked about ergot, right? And if you get an ergot problem in pigs, I mean, it's one of those sure signs, right? Because what happens, it acts like gangrene, and because it restricts the blood flow to the extremities. So what do you see? You see the tips of the ears start turning black and falling off, and their tails fall off. So again, the nice thing about hybrid rye is there's a lot less concern with that. So, okay. So we did another trial actually that the National Pork Board sponsored, and it was in a large system. Actually, we did it in a 2,400 pig wean to finish barn. Okay. And so basically, again, 2,400 had mixed sex pigs, both barrows and gilts. There were 4 different treatments that'll go through. And again, 30 pigs per pen, and we had 20 replicates per pen. So that worked out really well. We had a lot of duplication on that. Okay. So again, we're actually working with Pipestone production system there. And so it was a commercial wean to finish barn that they've got set aside for research. We had 7 different phases, and we marketed those pigs across 3 different events. So it took us 3 market events to empty out that barn. Okay, so here's what our 4 treatments were. The first one was 0% hybrid rye. The next one was 40%. Next one was 70%. And the last one was 100% rye. So you can see the big difference in there already in color between those things. So obviously we did the normal growth promotion or the growth response, right? What did we get for gain, feed intake, feed efficiency, those kinds of things. But the other thing is we want to look at carcass, right? Because when you look at the economics on a farm of anything, is it just gain or feed efficiency? No, there's a lot of other things come into play, right? I mean, so, you know, in your barn, you're concerned about how efficient they are, right? How much feed does it take? How fast do they grow? But you got to sell them somewhere. And so if you have a negative impact on carcass quality, that's really important too, because that's one of the ways you get paid for it. So basically what we did, all the pigs from those 3 different marketing groups got sent down to Fremont, Nebraska at the Holstone plant there. And from there, we got these values. We got hot carcass weight, back fat depth, yield or percent yield. And the other thing that we took a look at is iodine value. And all iodine value is the percent on saturation in a fat. Okay. So pigs, whatever you feed a cow, it's going to pretty much, the microbes in the rumen are going to turn it into a hard fat. So again, you look at a beef carcass, it's got that hard white tallow. That's really nice. But pigs, whatever kind of fat they eat, that's what they put on their body. Okay. In a great story, John Romans was a meat scientist at SDSU. And remember when omega-3s were the really healthy stuff that we all wanted? So John fed them fish oil, right? Which is high in omega-3s. And when they looked at the pork that was coming off of there, it was really high in omega-3s. What was the downside of that? When they fried those pork chops, it smelled exactly like fish. And why iodine value is so important, we worry about soft belly. So when DDGS first hit the market, it's okay, we can't feed more than 20% DDGS to finishing pigs. And it has nothing to do with gain, feed intake, or feed efficiency. We did a trial where we went to 60% DDGS and they performed just the same. The problem with DDGS, it's got corn oil in it, and that's unsaturated. And so these are examples of 2 frozen bellies. These, believe it or not, these are both frozen. So this is one with no DDGS in the diet. This is one with probably 40% DDGS in the diet. What's the most expensive piece on a pig? What's that? Bacon, the bellies, exactly. You know, it's so crazy, right? 30 years ago, bacon was going to kill us, and then we all want pork loin. And now you can go to Hy-Vee and get pork loin for $1.50 and bacon $7 a pound. But anyway, so what was happening, if your bellies, if the pig's bellies, not your bellies, but if the pig's bellies look like that, they can't slice it. It's too soft. They can't make bacon out of it, right? And so that's really a concern. But again, if you go back to that one of those first slides, hybrid rye, the nice thing that it doesn't have an unsaturated fat or as much, and it's low level. So that would be one thing that you can add to a diet that's going to help improve with that. So the other thing that we did, we took it one step farther. We took both the loin on the right side and the belly from 88 pigs, and we took them down to Kansas State University to do taste panel work, because that was the last thing that we're going to do. So basically the loins, they cut them into 1-inch sections, cooked them, and had a trained taste panel in there. And then with the bellies, basically we cured them and smoked them and did a taste panel as well, because ultimately we want to make sure whatever we do doesn't mess up that eating experience. Okay, so what did we look for? So loin would be basically juiciness, tenderness, and then any off flavors, right? We don't want to feed anything that's going to make that carcass bad. And then on the belly samples, we looked at saltiness, smoke intensity, bacon flavor, oxidized flavor, and off flavors. Those are the things that the panel looked at. Okay, so actually this is a shot of the barn where the trial's done, so it's pretty much a commercial setting. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the overall 89-day growth period. And so on the bottom, we've got 0, 40, 70, or 100% rye in the diet. Okay, and we did see a little bit of a decrease in average daily gain, right, as we increase them on a hybrid rye in a diet. And if gain is a little bit lower, that's going to mean market weight was a little bit lower, about 11 pounds lighter due to that. Okay, we look at feed intake and a slight reduction in feed intake. And so that explains why we saw a decrease in gain. If they're not eating as much feed, right, they're not going to gain as much. And so that would explain that reduction in gain. Okay, feed efficiency, interestingly enough, was not changed at all. Okay, this would be pounds of feed, pounds of gain per pounds of feed. So this would be feed per gain, the top number is what we're used to, and it was almost identical. And that's really important. So when you look at times when feed is really expensive, feed efficiency is really important, right? Because if you improve feed efficiency by 5%, 5% of a big number is significant, right? But 5% of a little number really doesn't mean anything. So when we look at this feed efficiency is really important because again, at the end of the day, when you look at the economics of raising pigs, gain's certainly important. Number one expense of raising pigs is feed costs, right? 65% of the cost of raising a pig is feed. So if it takes a little less feed to feed that pig, and you're talking, $7 corn, all of a sudden that's a lot of money. Okay, so let's take a look at the carcass stuff on it as well. So we look at the percent yield, and all percent yield is okay. So we kill the animal, right? We got a live weight on it. Okay, we kill it, and then we take the guts out, right? They kind of slit the throat, and everything comes out. So what's left is skin, bone, muscle, and fat. And so what we see as we add hybrid rye to it, right? We see a linear decrease in yield. Okay, and the reason why is there's more fiber in it. Okay, and if I were to show you a slide of DDGS to a diet, so let's say we went 0, 15, 30, 45% DDGS, you would see the exact same thing because DDGS is high in fiber. So all that means is you're losing a little more gut fill. So percent yield was down by 1%. We look at back fat depth. Actually, we saw as we added more rye to the diet, we saw less fat. And again, from the producer standpoint, depending on how the packer pays for you, that could be a benefit. Iodine value, and this one's really pretty cool because again, so the higher the number, the more unsaturated, the more of a problem you could have with soft bellies. So 0% rye was the highest. The more rye that we added, actually it went down. So packers shoot for about 72 for an iodine value. If it gets above, that's a problem. What makes this really nice with hybrid rye, so let's say all of a sudden DDGS gets cheap, okay? So if we're using hybrid rye as the grain source, we've already got a little bit of a cushion on there. So we can feed more DDGS when we're having a hybrid rye diet than we do with a corn diet to maintain that iodine value. So that gives you some flexibility. That's something that's pretty good out of there. Okay, the last thing, the sensory panel stuff. And actually what they did, there was a trained panel and there was 11 people on the panel, and I forget how many, 9 different reps that they went to. Okay, so this is for the loin section of it, right? So on top, 0, 40, 70, or 100% hybrid rye in the diet. So we've got juiciness, we've got tenderness, connective tissue, and then off flavor. Okay, so we take a look at this. And so anytime this number is below 0.05, that means there's a significant effect or the treatment caused this to happen. So if we look at initial juiciness, basically the more rye we fed, the less juicy it was. Sustained juiciness, initial juiciness. When we look at tenderness, we saw a decrease in there, but there's no difference in flavor. And so what I did, I asked our meat scientists yesterday, I said, okay, so if we go from, let's say juiciness, if we go from 54 to 41, or on tenderness, right, we go from 61 down to 59, can we tell it? I mean, if they put these 4 pork chops in front of us, could I line them up? And they said, no. These are trained people that did it. So yes, we do see a little bit of decrease in juiciness, a little bit of decrease in tenderness when we use hybrid rye. Average person's not going to pick it up. Okay, so that's something to think about. There we go. Okay, so we looked at the belly evaluation. Again, this is cured bacon, right? So texture, saltiness, smoke intensity, flavor or off flavor. And we come over here and really There was no significant differences found at all. So that's really promising. So the most expensive thing, we can go to 100% rye, and it does not affect the value of that bacon. Okay, so hybrid rye, from a growth performance standpoint, we had a little lighter body weight. That's because of lower average daily gain, because the pigs were eating a little bit less. And again, economically, feed efficiency is huge. Feed efficiency was not impacted. Okay, from the carcass standpoint, yield was a little bit less. That's going to happen anytime you feed fiber. If you were to feed barley, okay, barley's higher in fiber, you'd see the same thing. Decreased back fat, that's a positive. Decreased iodine value, right? Less soft bellies, that's a good. And finally, when we do the century panel stuff, less juicy, okay, and less tender. Okay, the other thing that we always talk to our students about, right? So you put together a diet. Okay, so you sit in your computer, you put the world's perfect diet together. That is only one part of it, because the other things that come into place would be milling efficiency, right? Okay, and that was my big concern, because I know when you process oats, when you process barley, it takes longer through a hammer mill or roller mill to get it down to a small particle size. So for pigs, we want particle size to be about 600 microns. It's a little better than cornmeal, and so the reason why we want that, the smaller that particle size, the more surface area on that corn. So your enzymes can break it down, pigs utilize more of it. So, and I was concerned that from a milling efficiency standpoint, it would take longer to grind a ton of hybrid rye than it would a ton of corn. Because if you think about it, either hammer mill or roller mill, let's say hammer mill, right? Got these hammers spinning really fast. You've got corn comes down, corn hits that hammer, and it just literally explodes, right? And if it's small enough, it's going to fall through the screen and then go where it's supposed to be. If it's not small enough, it's going to go around and get hit by the hammer again. But hybrid rye, any small grain isn't hard, right? It's kind of mushy. And so and the interesting thing is, so the commercial mill that we got the feed from, it was a triple roll mill. So it had 3 different rolls on there, and they saw no difference in throughput or electrical use. So from a milling standpoint, at least if you're using roller mills, 3 roller mills, that's not going to be an issue. And then finally, agronomic sustainability. We're working with a farm over in Minnesota who's head hybrid rye, and with some people from SDSU Ag Econ, going to look at the economics of having that as well, right? Because if you're a diversified operation, let's say you lose a little bit money on the pigs, but you make a boatload of money on the agronomic part. At the end of the day, all you care about is there's more money in your farm bank account at the end of the year, right? So we're going to look at that as well to see how that plays through. So again, want to thank the National Pork Board, Pipestone, Borba, and Ag, all these people who worked with us on that last project. And again, thank you for your support. I'd be glad to answer any questions. And if there's any SDS or any NDSU fans in here, I just want to repeat this in case you didn't hear the big news on what was that? January 8th, right? Go big, go blue, go Jack. So, okay. So what questions you guys have about hybrid rye and pigs? Yep. Yep. And actually, what's that? Oh, yep. The question is, can you feed that to sows? And the answer is yes. Because again, especially gestating sows, because we limit feed them, right? We limit feed them, so that extra fiber is actually a plus, because it's like us and lettuce, right? If you're feeding a sow 5 pounds a day, she's hungry. But if we feed something that's got fiber, again, it can be barley, it can be rye, whatever, they get that gut fill. So from a gestation standpoint, no problem. Even in lactation, Carly, how high can you go in a lactating diet? Yep. And again, the only reason why is that fiber, because that fiber's bulk, and just like us at a buffet, right? There's only X amount we can eat. If we would bypass the salad bar part of it, we could eat a lot more of the really good stuff. But so the fiber would be the limiting thing. Yep. But the big thing again, from the mycotoxin standpoint, ergot, we really want to watch that breeding herd and that wean pig. Okay, good. Oh, yep, there was also, Carly said less crushing in the farrowing stalls when hybrid rye was included at a high level. And again, I don't know if that's the sows feel more comfortable or whatever that is. Good. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Toller. So thanks for bearing with us. I know we're behind schedule, but this has been some really good conversation, and some good questions have been asked. So hopefully those of you online are getting good experience too. So our next speaker is Jack Davis. And Jack, I'm going to let you screen share. We'll give him just a minute here. So Jack is our crops business management field specialist with SDSU Extension. He has been with Extension. Jack, now I always forget, you just got a pin. Was it your 30-year pin?
Yeah, something like that.
He's been with Extension.
Since 94, whatever the math is. And I'm supposed to be doing math. Is that
What
Sharon?
happened, Bob? Hold on. Bob's making fun of you and I can't hear him.
Oh, yeah. Well, he should be quiet.
Jack is so old that you and Bob were in the same dorm.
We were
nice.
neighbors in the dorm. So, yeah.
That's great. So Jack is kind of a jack of all trades, if you will. Can you put your slides in presentation mode, Jack? There you go.
I thought it went. There we go. All right.
There you go. He's been with Extension, like I said, 30 years plus. He's a great mentor, and he really works across all of the different cropping systems to do the econ work for us. I was just talking to him last week at a meeting, and he said there used to be how many of people in your position? 4, maybe?
Yeah,
at one
we
time?
did. Yes.
Yeah, and now it's just him on the crop side, and Dr. Matt Dearson on campus, who's the specialist. So Jack does a lot of outreach across the state, and he's always willing to help out. So we really appreciate you being here today, Jack. And I'm gonna mute myself and turn it over to you and let you wrap this thing up. It's your job to keep him awake to the end here.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's good. I don't have all the nice pictures that the production guys do.
It'll be just fine.
Yeah. I thought it was pretty neat as Bob wrapped up there that there's less crushing. What you wouldn't even think of that in a gestation diet or whatever. But okay, so I got a few different things that we'll look at here. And just kind of comparing, and Pete and I have worked through this a few different times, and it's a way to get away from that corn soybean rotation, add some, as Bob said, sustainability to the cropping situation, and it works pretty good for livestock guys. So just looking at some budget stuff, and let me change my pointer to a laser, so that should help for you guys if I can do that correctly. Hopefully that shows up. So, and as Pete had said, a lot depends on when you can get it in. So this is where we would be getting the rye forage in early. We know we can get a decent yield. If we end up late, it's going to just drop in half, and we're going to minimize our input, probably no fertilizer, maybe less seed even, and not go for the higher forage yield. So we were just grazing this off. You'd have that ability to either graze it in the spring or as a fall cover crop is over here. So just showing utilization rate, 40%, cows weighing at 1,400. Oh, and probably fairly cheap on my grazing. So there's where we got to our grazing days that would be available. And these are all from information that's taken from the Southeast Farm on yields and stuff. So I'm probably cheap on grazing, especially this year. You know, you can probably take cattle in for a couple bucks or more. So there's a revenue. Really cost is going to be that seed and to get it drilled. And then when we're going for a little higher yield, we would throw some fertilizer at it. If we are in later, we're probably not going to throw any fertilizer. We're just using it for the cover and the benefits agronomically that we might get, and we'll just kind of take a little bit off of it. But either way, I think there's some benefits if we're doing forage. One thing that we've seen at the Southeast farm is if we're just strictly going to try forage, we might not need the hybrid rye, but that can always change. And if you want to go for the grain, I think there's definite advantages probably in the hybrid rye. So then we looked at comparing it to wheat, rye grain, and winter wheat, and it's really pretty competitive. So just showing a yield of 110 and 70, I just took him across some different years. So basically what's changing is price. I used actual prices from that year for wheat in those marketing years for wheat and the rye. And most rye is priced at about 85% of corn. So if you want to go and forward price your rye, if you were growing a crop of rye and wanted to forward price it, that's where your bid's going to be. They're actually going to use corn as a futures market to offset it, and they will forward price it for that, at least for the feed side anyway. So there, just our cost difference, a little more fertilizer for the winter wheat. I used 95 cent, and that's probably this year you might have ended up getting that a little cheaper, but I used that across the 3 different years. We end up with some fungicide treatment and things, a little more harvest costs on rye just for extra hauling of the grain. So I think what we've, when winter wheat is high, it gets a little closer, but otherwise there's probably a $40 to $50 advantage with rye over winter wheat. And as Pete said, you don't want to, if you're doing wheat and wheat is your deal, you probably don't want to mix the two on the farm because you can get yourself in trouble that way with the rye sticking around. Okay, so here we have 2,000 acre farm. Let me get rid of this on my side here. 2,000 acre farm, corn yield of 170, soybeans of 47. Forage rye did a half ton to 3.2 ton per acre of dry matter, and a hybrid rye of 110. A cover crop ended up about 2,750 pounds of dry matter. So you got the grazing off of that. So these are bushels of corn, bushels of soybeans. And here we had corn, our soybeans, we split some, and then we were able to put a forage rye in. So we're using a little, either taking this off for corn silage, or if we're using a shorter day soybean, we would have just a forage rye. So we're strictly going forage there. Here we had corn, soybeans, we did a hybrid rye and then a cover crop after it, back to corn, soybeans, hybrid rye, cover crop. So there's our bushel of corn that we would get off of this 2,000 acre farm, soybeans, hybrid rye, and then pounds of dry matter in the cover crop. This is a stacked rotation that Dwayne has done some research on out at the Dakota Lakes at Pierre. So 2 years of corn, soybean, hybrid rye, and then back to soybean again, and then over to corn. So on this first year of soybean, you're using a little shorter soybean and for a day for maturity, so you can get that hybrid rye in, and then we can use full season on the second one. The thing that we found is when you're longer rotation, more crops in the rotation, these will kind of equal out as far as yield goes. So we might have a little less yield on this one due to a shorter day, but it'll also bump because it's been multi-years since it's been soybeans. So anyway, here's the bushels. So just wanted to show, here's my total. Here's my first year, second year, first year, second year. And there's our hybrid rye. And then we would get a cover crop in there too. And then I got just some numbers on dollars, kind of general. I used new crop bids for this example. So I don't think I'm right at 1350 or so, and 550 on corn. So not the 7, but a new crop that we could get right now in the center of the state. That's what I ended up using, and kind of a budgeted cost. So I think probably, we got a lot of numbers floating around. I think what we really want to just probably look at is that we are able to net out very close to what we would be or over what we would be in a corn soybean situation. And I know it's really going to depend on how this reacts on your farm and what your costs are. But we didn't talk so much on what as Bob had alluded to, the sustainability and the benefits we get from a longer rotation in this first year corn coming in here. We wouldn't even have to use any type of stack deal there. Our weeds are going to be suppressed, diseases are going to be cut. So really quite a benefit to our corn over just our corn soybean rotation. The other thing, the ability to get manure back onto the field. And, that's not one thing that I've really necessarily accounted for in this. We just took yields based on other studies that they've done at the Southeast Farm and other locations, and Dakota Lakes, I should say. So really just wanted to kind of highlight that, we are netting, even with the added rotation or added crop. Some guys will say, well, I can't get as much money for it, but we really can. We can very closely net out what we would in a traditional corn soybean rotation. So just I went through it fairly fast because I know we're running up on time, but just kind of wanted to give that highlight of things to think about. And gosh, if you're thinking about it, I think don't be necessarily scared of it from an economic standpoint. I think guys can start to make it work in their rotation. And as Pete and I have discussed, as sustainability and things take more of a presence, hybrid rye is probably a benefit in that its yield is good. There hopefully it will be work to increase yield. Sometimes when Pete has talked, he's shown a slide of how corn has increased over time. And since its hybrid introduction, it's just been a steady climb in yield. And hopefully that will be coming with rye, that its yield can just continually increase as corn has. And that may be a strong possibility. So I think there's benefits to our whole system in taking a look at hybrid rye. And if you're more in that forage situation, adding just maybe the forage rye for rotation and helping break that corn soybean rotation up and adding another crop to it. I think I just had some quick nutrition deal, which those guys covered very well. And that is my contact information. And then of course, the woolly worm, but we're darn near through winter. And this was from a couple of winters ago. So I just had that slide saved. Questions?
Any questions in the room or online? Okay, Jack, you see, you're good at keeping us on time. You just shorten that up.
You said I had to not let him fall asleep, so that was the challenge, I guess.
You accounting people love numbers.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if someone does have questions for any of the speakers today, you can get a hold of us through the emails that are listed, or you can call the Southeast Farm or myself, and we can certainly get you in contact with the speakers. We really appreciate everybody that attended online and in person. Thanks to those of you who braved the weather and made it here. Hopefully this was worth your while. I felt like I even learned some things, and I've heard some of these talks and still learned quite a bit here today too. So we really appreciate the sponsors, the speakers, and for those of you that came. One thing I'd ask of everyone is if you could please fill out the survey. If you're in the room, it's just a little half sheet of paper that Ruth gave you when you came in. That just gives us an idea of what we need to do in the future, or what you actually want to hear from us. Otherwise, we really don't know. And if you're online, I put the survey link in the chat. It came from Ruth Stevens. You'll see it in the chat there. If you can just click on that link, it will not take long. There is some demographic information at the end, and oftentimes people ask about that. The reason that the federal government wants us to collect that is to make sure that we're reaching a wide span of audiences. They want to make sure that we're not just reaching one group of people. So that's why we do that. So if I'm not seeing anything, if there's not any further questions, we want to thank everybody for coming. Peter and Ruth and the Southeast Farm staff, along with our speakers today, put this together, did a really great job. And we want to just make sure we appreciate that. And hopefully you all travel home safe. And those of you online, you know, that long walk across the living room, hopefully that goes well. So have a good day. And if you caught half of it, if you're online, you caught half of this, or you're interested in sharing it with a friend, we are going to try, pending, we need to make sure it's okay with our speakers, but we'll try to share this recording at some point online so you can come back to this info. And we are having the same meeting tomorrow in Wagner. It's going to happen at the same time, 1 to 3:30, and that one was set up to be a hybrid event from the beginning. So everyone that signed up should have the link for that and be able to attend. So thanks again. See you, Jack.
Yes. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sarah, and everybody.
Thanks, Zach. Good luck.
Yeah, see you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Sounds good. We'll just hang on for a minute here in case someone has questions, but